You didn't choose to be alone, at least not like this. Not in the way it arrived, quietly, unannounced, like the closing of a door you didn't hear until it latched. You used to be surrounded by voices, by movement, by needs and questions and laughter and schedules that never seemed to stop. And now suddenly, or maybe not suddenly at all, you wake into silence, not always painful, but present, heavy in its own way. Maybe the house is still full of objects, but empty of presence. Maybe the phone rings less, maybe the conversations that used to stretch long into the evening now fit into a brief exchange or don't come at all. This isn't how you imagined it. When you thought of growing older, you imagined more time, yes, but not time spent so often alone. You thought there would still be company, still shared coffee, still small arguments over nothing, still someone sitting across from you at the end of the day, even in silence. Instead, silence became your company, and it's okay to admit that shift hurts, because it's not about having nothing to do, it's about feeling unaccompanied inside your own life. Schopenhauer didn't romanticize this. He knew that solitude, when forced upon us, can feel like abandonment, that the loss of connection, especially after a lifetime of being tethered to others, can shake the ground beneath us. And yet he also believed that solitude was essential, not as punishment but as passage. The challenge is that solitude doesn't arrive as peace. It arrives first as absence, the absence of routine, the absence of being needed, the absence of noise that once filled the space between thoughts. It can feel like something is missing, but sometimes what's missing is only the distraction, and in its place, a different kind of awareness begins to emerge. But that awareness takes time. You don't arrive at peace just because things are quiet. First, you grieve the noise. You mourn the life you once had, the presence of others, the sense of being a central part of something. That mourning is not weakness. It's acknowledgement. You didn't choose this solitude, not in the way it came, but now it's here. And the question becomes not how do I fill it, but how do I live inside it without fear? Schopenhauer would tell you that most people run from solitude because they are terrified of meeting themselves, but you are not most people. You've lived enough to know that peace rarely comes from others, and maybe, just maybe, this solitude is not your enemy. It's your threshold, a place where something new can begin. Not because others return, but because you do. There was a time when noise was simply part of life, not just the sound of voices or footsteps, but the motion, the interruption, the endless orbit of other people's needs pulling at you from every direction. You woke up and someone needed something. A meal, a ride, a decision, a hand on their forehead, a question answered. There were errands to run, papers to sign, clothes to wash, arguments to break up, events to attend, holidays to organize. And maybe you didn't always love the chaos, but you learned how to live in it. You moved through the noise like a current, and then, slowly, without announcement, it began to quiet. The rooms emptied, the questions stopped, the lists grew shorter. And at first it seemed like relief, a long exhale, but then the days stretched out longer than expected, and the silence that followed felt strange, like a familiar song that had stopped in the middle of the chorus. You realized the noise hadn't just filled your schedule, it had filled your identity. Who are you, now that no one is knocking on your door, asking where their shoes are, or what's for dinner, or whether you've seen their keys? Schopenhauer called most of this noise what it really is: distraction, not because it was meaningless, but because it often pulled us away from ourselves. When we are constantly reacting, constantly responding, We don't have to ask harder questions. We don't have to sit still long enough to notice what's going on inside. The world, especially when we're younger, makes a lot of noise on our behalf. But now, for perhaps the first time in a long time, you are sitting in a room with only your own voice. And at first that can feel like loss, but it may also be the beginning of something else. Silence can feel empty, but it can also be space. Space to reflect, space to breathe without being rushed, space to look honestly at your own life without distraction and without anyone else's opinion shaping what you see. Schopenhauer believed that most people fear silence not because it's unpleasant, but because it reveals things they've long avoided. And yet the only way to find real clarity is to walk through that silence, to let the noise fall away, to see what remains. The noise that disappeared wasn't just about sound. It was a structure, a rhythm, a comfort. Its absence may feel like absence of meaning, but it's really the beginning of meaning that no longer depends on being busy. In this quiet, you are not being punished. You are being reintroduced to yourself. And though it may feel strange, even disorienting, it may also be the most honest season of your life. The space where what matters finally has room to speak. And what speaks now is you. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It doesn't feel like rest. It feels like something missing, something that used to be there and now isn't. Not just the sound of another voice, but the feeling of being included, of being seen, of mattering in someone else's daily rhythm. It hits hardest in the ordinary moments, sitting at the table with no one across from you, turning to make a comment and remembering there's no one there to hear it, making a meal that no one will notice, walking into a quiet house that feels too quiet. This is not the gentle quiet of solitude. This is the sharp edge of loneliness, and it's important to say, you're not weak for feeling it. You're not broken because silence makes you ache. Schopenhauer made a distinction that matters deeply here, one we rarely talk about in ordinary life. He wrote that loneliness is the pain that comes when we depend on others to fill something inside us and they do not, while solitude is the freedom that arises when we stop waiting for others to do that and begin to live inwardly instead. But he never said the transition between the two was easy. The truth is, most of us don't choose solitude. It finds us. Through distance, through time, through loss. Through children growing up and growing away. Through friends who disappear without reason. Through partners who stop reaching out. Loneliness comes first, and it can feel like standing outside a house you once lived in, watching other people pass by, wondering if they even remember you were there. It's not that you want to be the center of attention. It's that you want to be remembered, included. You want to know that someone out there is thinking of you without needing anything. And when that doesn't happen, silence feels less like a pause and more like a disappearance. But here's where something can begin. If you can sit in that silence long enough, if you can stop fighting it just for a moment, you may begin to hear something else. Not the noise of the world coming back, but the sound of your own life, stripped of its demands, speaking in a voice that's quieter, but more truthful. The ache of loneliness may not vanish, but it can evolve into reflection, into space, into a new kind of freedom. Not freedom from people, but freedom from the need for constant confirmation. You begin to realize that what felt like absence was also opportunity. Not to isolate, but to rediscover. Rediscover your own pace, your own interests, the thoughts you abandoned when others filled your attention. Solitude begins not when the noise ends, but when you no longer need the noise to know who you are. And Schopenhauer's point wasn't that solitude is always joyful, but that it is honest, and in honesty peace becomes possible again. So if the silence feels heavy today, if it feels more like absence than rest, stay with it just a little longer. Something else may be waiting underneath the ache. Not the return of others, but the return of yourself. Before we continue, just know, this is not the end of the video. There's more still to come. But if you found even a small piece of yourself in what we've said so far, we invite you to stay connected. Consider subscribing to the channel, not as an act of routine, but as part of creating a space where honesty and reflection are still welcome. And if someone you know is quietly struggling with solitude, sharing this may offer them comfort without needing to explain a thing. Let's continue now. There's still more to uncover. Solitude only begins to change when you stop fighting it, when you stop looking at silence as something to be fixed. That doesn't happen overnight. At first, being alone feels like being left behind, but slowly, often without you realizing it, something inside begins to shift. You stop checking your phone as often. You notice the shape of the light in your home at different times of day. You sit with a book longer than usual. You start listening to yourself again. Not the critical voice, the one that replays old regrets, but the deeper one, the one that gets buried beneath the noise of constant interaction. You begin to hear your thoughts not as background noise, but as the beginning of conversation with yourself. This is where solitude becomes something else. Schopenhauer didn't see solitude as a punishment. He saw it as the true arena of the mind. He believed that only in solitude could we begin to see life without distortion, without the pressure of pleasing, without the tension of performance. It's here, in this space, that reflection can finally breathe. You begin to revisit parts of yourself you've forgotten. Old interests, abandoned thoughts, quiet dreams that didn't make it into your earlier life because there was no room. You remember that you used to love certain music, that reading late into the night used to make you feel alive, that walking with no destination can sometimes say more to the soul than a crowded conversation. You begin to rebuild a world that doesn't rely on anyone else to keep it meaningful. That's not bitterness. That's restoration. Solitude gives you the chance to stop defining yourself by your usefulness to others, and in its place you begin to live more truthfully. You don't need to announce your thoughts. You don't need approval before making small choices. You no longer need to explain your moods or justify your preferences. You can simply be, and for the first time in a long time, that may be enough. Meaning doesn't disappear just because no one is watching. In fact, it may grow more sincere when lived without performance. You drink tea slowly. You reread something you once underlined in a book from decades ago. You let the silence stay and realize it no longer feels empty. There is a deep spiritual peace in that moment, a sense that life, even as it changes, is still yours to live. Schopenhauer believed that the truest part of ourselves only emerges when the audience disappears, not because we hide who we are from others, but because we often never truly meet ourselves until we are alone. Solitude, accepted without bitterness, becomes not exile, but freedom. The freedom to think clearly, to feel fully, to belong to your own experience. And in that belonging, peace begins to take root. You've likely heard it your whole life, that connection is everything, that happiness is found in togetherness, in gatherings, in the closeness of many voices around a table, and sometimes that's true, but not always, and not for everyone. There is a quiet truth that few speak aloud, that not everyone finds their fullness in others, and that choosing to be alone, really alone, is not failure. It is not sadness. It is clarity. You are not broken because you prefer silence to small talk. You are not behind because you find more meaning in a solitary walk than in a loud room. You are not missing anything, because the life you are living right now may be the most honest one you've ever known. Schopenhauer warned that many suffer, not because they are alone, but because they fear what they might discover when they no longer have others to distract them from themselves. The discomfort people feel in solitude is not about absence, it's about unfamiliarity. Most of us have spent so many years orbiting around others, family, work, obligations, that we've forgotten how to sit inside our own soul. And when life finally brings us back to ourselves, we mistake that moment for loss. But what if it's not loss? What if it's return? What if you're not missing out, but finally coming home to your own rhythm, to the thoughts you never had space to follow, to the calm you were told was loneliness but which now feels like relief. This world often equates presence with performance. If you're not posting, talking, gathering, proving, then you must be fading. But Schopenhauer believed the opposite, that only in the absence of applause do we discover who we really are. He saw solitude not as lack, but as liberation from the need to be seen. If you no longer crave constant validation, if you no longer need your life to be interpreted by others in order to feel it is real, then you are not failing. You are maturing. Deeply, quietly, fully. You are no longer living in reaction. You are beginning to live in presence. Not everyone will understand this. Some will say, you should get out more. Others may pity what they think you've lost, but they don't see what you've gained. They don't feel the stillness you've cultivated, the gentle strength of not needing the crowd, the power of belonging to yourself. So the next time you sit alone, without noise, without obligation, don't ask yourself what you're missing. Ask instead, what have I finally found? There is a quiet freedom that begins when you stop performing, when you no longer wake up trying to impress, to prove, to be useful in order to be seen. For many, this freedom doesn't come until later in life, after the expectations of others have loosened, after the roles you've carried begin to fade. You might not have chosen to live alone. You might not have expected your days to unfold this way, unwitnessed, unshared. But here you are. And for the first time, there is space to ask a different question. What do I want my life to feel like now, without anyone watching? No schedules to maintain for someone else. No eyes measuring your output. No pressure to explain your moods, your slowness, your choices. Just time and room to breathe, to think, to move through the day in your own rhythm, not in reaction to others. This is not exile. This is liberation. Schopenhauer wrote that most people chase validation because they've never been taught how to exist without it. From childhood, we are rewarded for pleasing others. We are shaped by what brings praise, and so we learn to perform. Even love sometimes becomes something we earn through usefulness, reliability, self-erasure. But what happens when those who once clapped are no longer there? When the crowd has faded and the stage is empty? Many fear that moment. But Schopenhauer saw it differently. He believed that only without applause can we finally begin to live for truth. Not external truth, but internal alignment. What do you enjoy? Not because it impresses, but because it nourishes. What does your mind return to when no one is interrupting it? Who are you when no one is asking anything from you? The answers don't need to be profound. You might find that your favorite moment is early morning light across the table. That reading for an hour uninterrupted brings you more peace than most conversations. That tending a plant, writing a letter you'll never send, or sitting in a quiet room with music that only you hear, gives you more than any validation ever did. There is no need to post it, no need to report it. It still counts, it still matters. Aging alone is not an erasure. It is a return to a life that moves from the inside out. A life that doesn't need constant approval to be meaningful. You get to choose how your day unfolds. You get to protect your energy, to curate your world, to step outside the cycle of performance, not as retreat, but as strength. This doesn't mean you've stopped loving others. It doesn't mean you've shut the door to connection. It just means you've stopped living for the spotlight and started living for something softer, deeper, and more quietly fulfilling. In Schopenhauer's view, this is where real wisdom begins, not with acclaim but with alignment, not with praise but with peace. When the house is quiet and the world no longer calls for your attention, the question becomes simple, though not easy. What kind of companion are you to yourself? Not what others say about you, not what you've achieved, but how you treat yourself. In thought, in tone, in the privacy of your inner voice. Many people spend their whole lives attending to others, but rarely stop to examine how they speak to their own soul. Is your inner voice harsh? Does it rush, criticize, interrupt? Or is it kind, steady, curious? Schopenhauer believed that the ability to live with oneself peacefully was one of the rarest forms of strength. Not isolation, not detachment, but self-sufficiency. A life where you're no longer dependent on others for company, not because you reject love, but because you have finally built something within yourself that can sustain you. This is not about being endlessly happy. It's about being honest, about sitting with your thoughts and not needing to escape them, about building small, sacred rituals. The morning cup of coffee, the walk at dusk, the page you write before bed, not for others to see, but for the quiet structure they offer to your own day. These are not signs of boredom. They are acts of care, and in time, they become something more than routine. They become relationship, a deepening connection with yourself, not through perfection, but through presence. You learn to listen to your moods without rushing them away. You speak gently when you catch yourself in old habits of self-blame. You forgive more quickly. You begin to trust your own rhythm. And gradually, the silence around you starts to feel less empty, because it's filled now, not with noise but with awareness. You're not waiting for someone to come fix the day. You are already in conversation with the only person who has been there for every part of your life, you. And that relationship, when tended to with care, becomes the most loyal company you will ever keep. Schopenhauer called this the foundation of philosophical life. A person who can live in solitude, not in bitterness but in inner balance, has moved from dependence to depth. And when you reach that place, even the quietest day carries meaning, because you're not trying to escape yourself. You are learning how to stay. The room is still. No one calls your name, no one interrupts your thoughts, no one fills the silence with conversation or chaos. And yet, something in you has changed. What once felt like absence now feels like space. The very same room, the one that once echoed with loneliness, now holds something softer, not perfection, not constant joy, but a quiet clarity. Schopenhauer believed that solitude, when fully embraced, becomes the most honest environment for the human soul, not because it protects us from pain, but because it removes distraction, leaving only the truth. And in that truth we discover what we no longer need to chase. You no longer need to prove your value by being useful. You no longer need to be heard in order to be valid. You no longer need to seek a crowd to feel real. The empty room, once feared, becomes a sacred space. A space where life no longer demands that you perform, but invites you to simply be. You sit, you breathe. You notice how little you actually need in this moment to feel whole. There is no applause, but there is peace. There is no spotlight, but there is light. You are not broken because you are alone. You're not fading because others are not watching. You are simply arriving at the place where freedom begins. The freedom to feel what you feel without judgment. The freedom to shape your day without permission. The freedom to think deeply, move slowly and exist gently, without defending your solitude as something to be fixed. This is not resignation, it's release. And though it may never look like the life you once imagined, it is still a life. A full one, a quiet one, a life with depth. Schopenhauer didn't promise happiness. He promised lucidity, the ability to see life clearly and still choose to live it with dignity. And maybe that is what peace really is. Not the return of the past, not the arrival of something new, but the slow unfolding of yourself, inside the space where no one else needs to be. If you're in that room now, if life has grown quieter than you expected, if the silence still feels unfamiliar, just know, this is not your ending, it's your beginning. And the room is not empty. It is waiting for you to fully arrive. If these reflections gave you even a moment of calm, we invite you to stay with us. This is a space made for people who carry quiet stories, not to be fixed, but to be honored. Subscribing isn't about joining a trend. It's about finding a place to return to when the world grows too loud or too distant. And if you think someone else might need this kind of stillness, sharing the video may mean more to them than you'll ever know. Thank you for being here. We're not finished talking, just beginning to speak more clearly.